Thanks everyone for joining today's Hits Meet. The topic is Sales Webinar Series 3 on cold calling. Many would say that cold calling is something they would really think twice to do. And often it is very difficult to connect with someone on with really taking the first step and trying to really talk about get them engaged. Here we're going to cover some practical tips on how different companies use different kinds of strategies and how they really target the companies, understand what to talk about, and effectively be able to reach out to the right prospects and convert them into leads and later into potential customers also. So I would request Samrat to take this forward, and thank you, Samrat, for agreeing to do this webinar for us.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, and pleasure meeting all of you. And thank you for coming on over a long weekend evening for this session. So, what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes. So, I personally am not going to give you some 10 ways how to master your cold calling because it takes a long time. I'm just going to give a high level perspective based on practical experience because I run a company that does sales outreach and other kind of activities for technology companies. So that is what we're going to cover from a practical point of view. What are the things that you need to keep in mind? Of course, it's a high level overview because typically you need to prepare quite a lot to get really ready for doing that cold calling. So just to set the context right, our session is predominantly focused on B2B enterprise selling. So it is not meant for selling into B2C, business to customers. It is mainly meant for products or solutions which are targeted at the enterprises, where or could be early stage companies also, but where there is B2B selling involved. It's going to be about practical tips rather than some kind of theoretical fun days that I'm going to give. I'm going to focus a lot on what not to do because that is more important many times when you are actually reaching out for your offerings to your prospects. We'll deal with the who, what, why, how kind of things also, the usual things we'll cover through the presentation. And of course, we will cover the most important part, how to make a cold call warm. And that is something which, that's where the art and the science comes together. So, what is cold calling? Now, I picked this definition lazily from Wikipedia. It says it's a solicitation of business from potential customers who had no prior contact with the salesperson conducting the call. Now, more or less, if you look at various sales trainings that your organization would give you, typically this is more or less the kind of definition that you will hear. You may even hear it's like lead generation, it is prospecting, it is sales outreach or whatever. But more or less the definition would be similar. Now I'm going to just rip this apart because this is something where the whole objective of cold calling goes down. And that is where people make mistakes. First of all, it is not solicitation of business. You do not solicit business on the cold calls to your potential customers. I would secondly question about no prior contact. There should be a prior contact before you make that dial that number, and that is always the best way. And that is how you make a cold call into a warm call. And it's normally not a salesperson doing that call when you are in a B2B enterprise selling space. If your product is something that can be bought over the phone in maybe a couple of calls, then yes, it's a salesperson who basically is responsible for closing the sale as well. But when you talk about a typical B2B enterprise selling setup, you're talking about people who are able to open up those discussions for the sales people to take it forward because the sales cycle over there is slightly complex. So my problem with this definition remains it is more of an engagement with that individual rather than solicitation of business. Second, you warm up the contact before making that cold call. Third, it's a different skill set that is required for conducting that call. We'll come to that slowly as we go through the presentation. Secondly, understand that it is not just for doing sales. If you're an entrepreneur, you have to make cold calls to investors. If you're a job seeker, you have to make cold calls into targeted companies where you're looking for a job. If you're a company that's reached some stage and you want to get some media coverage, you do some calls over there. You do calls if you're talent sourcing for your companies, which getting talent these days is very difficult. So you need to sell yourself, your company's value proposition to the potential employees. And of course, you'll be surprised, but if you're an early stage company that has gone through all the pain, sometimes convincing suppliers to take you seriously also requires some amount of selling, and that's where cold calling also needed. I'm just going to dwell into this kind of a photo. And if you had attended the initial sessions on prospecting, you might have come across this photo as well. This defines what prospecting is. The term prospect actually emerged during the gold rush in the America, and where people were looking for gold, minerals, other valuable stuff. And the ratio of success was minuscule. I mean, out of 100, 1% would strike gold at that point in time because it was being done wherever they could do. There wasn't so much of a scientific approach and all. And that is why, and that is something which happens even in this cold calling, because you typically get your ratios are very low. And people are very happy, like, we get 5% hit rate, and which is good and all. That's because you're not doing your homework properly. You're not following a good well process. You're not really sharpening the X before you go. So when you talk of prospecting, you have to understand that to prospect at the right places, at the right time, with the right tools. And that is why I bring the relevance of this particular photograph, that the sketch, which I always like when I talk about prospecting. So your cold calling is not for lead generation. It is not for opportunity creation. It is definitely not for sales. It is just an opportunity to generate a lead, is what I would define as an objective of that cold call. 2-point test that I believe is an effective, there's a right amount of company. One is the company should be right for the product or service that you're selling. Secondly, the person should be an RPC. Now, people who are in sales would be very familiar with this term RPC, which is a right party contact. Now, this right party contact, you have to understand, is that something which is not really one person, there could be many, and that can also vary during the sales cycle that you're following for your particular offering. Let us take an example. Through the presentation, let us use this example that we are selling for an HRMS software company. We are targeting large companies in particular geography. So your right party contact, most people would say, would be the HR director or the head of HR. I would say yes, but he's not the person you would approach in the first instance. I'll come to that slowly. Why? If you are going to call into the HR director selling your HRMS software, sorry, your success rate is going to be very, very low. We'll come to as to how to solve that problem. Before that, remember one thing. Each cold call that you make is, of course, an opportunity to sell. It's also a risk of losing forever in that account, or rather to that individual whom you're trying to sell. So remember, the preparation that goes before you make that every cold call is so important that only then you'll be able to really get good hit rates, success rates over there. It's all in the mind. My favorite quote, George Harrison. Very, very important that people who are doing this cold call, whether they are senior executive salespeople in the company, or you have an inside sales team, or you are a founder of a new venture, you have to do cold calls. Make sure you are in the right mindset at that point in time. Positivity is extremely important. What you're going to talk about is extremely important. And dissociating yourself from the outcome is extremely important. If you're going to get into a call with a particular expectation that I'm going to pitch in my product, I'm going to ask him for a demo, those things, it is not going to work that way. Go with an open mind, go with a relaxed mind, but go with an extremely positive frame of mind. Energy is very important. This is what we do every day before the session, before those calling hours begin. And they have to do it through the day. The managers have to do it on the floor regularly for the people. Remember, this is something which I used to hear all the time. Some will, some won't. So what next? So you will face more rejections than you will see acceptances. So remember that whether it's a cold call or email or whatever, you are going to face rejections 90% of the time. That is what sales is made up of. You just have to make sure that 90 goes down to 80, and that is where your skills come in, your hard work comes in. So what's the typical process that is followed? You have a product. So let's say we have an HRMS product. So you understand the proposition, you understand the differentiators, you make a script, then build the data of your target audience, the RPCs as we say, and then call, call, call. What's the result? A frustrated inside sales executive, a frustrated SDR, a sales development reach out executive. Because this process is not going to get you anywhere. This process is just going to get you maybe a few meetings here and there, which is odd for if you're lucky. Never follow the standard process that's followed by most companies. And that is where people go wrong when they do this cold calling for their companies. See, remember, it is all about opening a relation, not selling. If you get that point right, then you will understand. You will not be able to sell because let's face it, no matter what, people don't like to be sold. Just imagine going into any mall and walking into a showroom. The salespeople walk up towards you. You would always resist. No, no, I'm fine. I'll just look around. When you want something, we'll go and talk to that salesperson. But people do not like to be sold, even if they want that particular thing. So keep that objective as an objective of opening a relation. Then you will not fall into that nonsensical process that everybody follows. Do conversations and no pitching. Cold calling shouldn't be about pitching, it should be about conversations. What should that conversation be about? It should be about the problem that you're solving. Don't jump to the solution. Don't get into things like we'll be able to save 30% of your costs and increase your top line by 20%, blah, blah, blah. Discuss the problem. Let's say that HRMS problem software solves the problem of your compliance issues, of your end, giving you an end-to-end service and everything. It reduces the time and everything. Discuss the problem that the industry has and only then talk about the solution. Focus on simple next steps. Don't try to conclude things with the call. It doesn't work like that. So a simple step could be arranging a demo. Simple step could be I'll send you some material, then I will call you back after 3 days. Those kind of the simple step. Make it very simple for the person who is on the other side to follow that next step and help you to do that next step along with him. Okay. Now, GitHub and no Vito. People who are familiar with sales would have heard of Vito, but GitHub is something which I have mated toward myself. Vito is a very important top officer. So coming back to the HRMS software, your very important top officer is the head of HR or the HR director or HR executive vice president or whoever, depending on what the title. But the top person in the HR department is going to be a very important. Of course, other people will also come in. But you don't just go to the RPC, your Vito or the RPC at that point in time. You have 5 different personas that you do create, although that picture shows 4 for some reason I couldn't get anywhere with the 5 heads, so just excuse me for that. The gatekeeper persona, these are people who will not have any hold of the decision, but they are the people who can stop you from going to the decision maker or take you to the decision maker. Influencers, people may not have any role in the decision making, they seriously influence how the decision will be taken. A thought leader persona, these are people typically in large companies who are senior enough, but they may not have role directly, but they are heard in the organization. And this typically happens in European countries where people who have been in the company for a long time and people who are senior in age, even if they have not reached seniority professionally, they are heard in the industry, heard in the company. And those are the thought leaders kind of persona. Then there is a user persona. Typically, for an HR MS software, a user persona would be your people who are actually going to use the software. So the junior people in the HR department. And then the buyer persona. These are people who are actually going to buy. So that is where the veto comes in, the very important top officers. But your right party contact are all across these five. All these five are your right party contacts. So remember, it is not B2B or B2C, it is B2I. It is business to individual. So when you make that script or a conversation, whatever you're going to do on the call, remember that you need to have it differently made for all the five people. When you are talking to the gatekeeper, and the first gatekeeper you always encounter is the receptionist or the personal assistant, what you're going to talk to her or him is going to be very different from what you're going to talk to a user or somebody. Never make the mistake of pitching in an idea, pitching in your product to the gatekeeper. That's not going to work. They wouldn't even understand that in many cases. So it is B2I. So remember, whenever you're making a cold call, make a table of whether that person is a G, I, T, U, or B. And based on that, your script should be developed. Identify the problems for a company, solve the individual problem, not for the company. Everybody has a different problem, you understand that. The head of HR would be responsible for the budgets also, would be responsible for the compliance also, and a lot of other things as a departmental head. So he or she needs to get a complete perspective that solves the top three problems that he or she is going to get. Whereas if we are talking to the user of an HRMS software, that user is going to be predominantly concerned about the features that product is going to offer. So when you talk to that person, you talk about the features at that time. After that, you go to the buyer. When you go to the buyer, you talk about the numbers over there in terms of what point of cost savings and all. So your problem is something that you need to identify for that individual rather than for the company. There is no one size fits all. The pitch for every company or the conversation need to strike with different people within the organization will vary from company to company. That is where your research comes in. So if you're pitching in for a large company, it's fairly easy to find out what kind of HRMS software they're using. And you would know as to how your software stacks up against that. And that should be your conversation point. And that is how you'll be able to get that kind of a next step pretty easily. Okay, the biggest problem that most people face, 90% of the time will be hitting the reception. But many few bosses would really guide you as to how to get past that first layer. Just imagine the reason why the cold calling has such a low rate of success is because 90 of your calls out of 100 are going to receptionist. How are you going to make sure you go ahead? I mean, people prepare everything. Okay, this is what I'm going to talk to the decision maker. This is what I'm going to talk to the user, and blah blah blah. But they do not know how to prepare yourself to get past the receptionist. That's the first challenge you have to break, and you should prepare most very well to get across. First of all, understand the patterns of the receptionist when they're working, when they're not working. Typically, receptionists work in shifts and they stick to those shifts. So their time could be 8:30 to 5:30 or whatever. They will have a couple of breaks planned, a lunch break and something, and those times would vary. Try to find those patterns. If you're really going after large companies and it's like must have accounts, you need to have a clear idea of the working patterns of those receptionists. You should know who are the five receptionists who sit through the day, and you should know their names and everything. And that is where your initial ghost calls come in. And ghost calls are calls which are not meant for selling or even striking conversation, but you just call up for whatever reason just to find out the names of those people and their shifts and everything. Typically, you need to have a reference point when you call them. So let us say you are calling some receptionist. Her name is Mandy. When you're calling Mandy, you need to be able to tell Mandy, Mandy had called yesterday and Sarah had picked up the phone and she had asked me to give a call right now because I believe Mr. Steven Smith might be available at this point in time. If you say this, maybe I'm just cooking this up right now. But something like that, if you're able to put the chances of Mandy remember giving you a good hearing is much higher. So you focus on that point and make sure that you are able to get that kind of a reference point. Third, show familiarity even if that is fake. When I say familiarity, say let's say if I call up the receptionist and say I want to speak to the HR director of your company, which basically means I do not know who the HR director is. I'm definitely calling to sell something, which means the next question is coming, what is this regarding? Then she knows she has been trained to do that. She's going to ask you, okay, and then she's going to say that, okay, he's busy right now. Can you send an email? And that's what it's a typically you're gone. You're basically you're not going to go ahead anywhere after that. Whereas if I say, I need to talk to Steve from HR, that's a different kind of a confidence that you, because the person at the reception gets a feeling that this person seems to know Steven Smith, and you're trying to call him and reach him, and then obviously she's going to get what is this regarding. You can say this regarding that HR thing discussion we had over email. So build familiarity with an email. So assuming you sent an email before you're calling, which is what you should do all the time, then that sets a context. That is how you get past the receptionist. There are the tricks how you can get over them. Last but not the least, be always firm with them. If you try to be that friendly sales guy, hey Mandy, how are you? And those kind of things don't work. Those are things that used to work in the past, but those don't work. Simply because they also learned the tricks of the training. They have been in that role for quite some time and they know what to do. But you have to be firm that you have to talk. You can even go to the some extent and say that that's not a decision for you to make. You need to pass my message to so and so and let him say that he's not interested in talking to me. That is fine. You have to do that. You have to be firm with those kind of things. Slight firmness does help over there. Okay, so now you got past the receptionist, you got to the person. Now, what are you going to talk? Are you going to talk about where you're calling from, what kind of product you have, how great your product is, and everything? Just stop doing all that. Just discuss the problem that you have. This is the problem we are solving. So, first of all, you have to be sure that that problem does exist in the industry and your product does solve it. If your product is not solving that problem, there's no point in discussing that problem. If that problem doesn't exist in the industry, it's not a problem at all. It's a perceived problem that you may have. So basically, discuss that problem, focus on that problem, and only when the situation is right, you talk about how you are able to solve that problem without making any false, frivolous claims like we can solve all your problems and we can increase your top line by 40%, give you a bottom line of 30%, and blah blah blah. Those things don't work. Discuss the problem. Remember, it is not for the prospect to understand you, it is for you to understand the prospect. The better you understand the prospect, better your chances of getting that connect properly and taking the discussion forward. Asking the right questions is extremely important through the conversation. So have a script ready, what kind of questions you should be asking them, and these should again vary by whether you're talking to the gatekeeper, whether you're talking to the influencer or a buyer or a user. That person says there's no need for your services. That doesn't mean he's not a prospect. Prospects are eternal. He has no need for our services now. He's not a lead, but he's still a prospect because you can still say to that person 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line. So don't write off people so easily from your prospect list. So many people, when they are getting into cold calling and all, work a lot on collaterals, prepare presentations, prepare emails, and of course everything is fine. We should do that. But unless you are able to strike those conversations, your collaterals are not going to sell. Conversations will. You need to be able to converse regarding the problem that you're going to solve, and that is where your knowledge about that problem is your power, and that is how you are able to strike those conversations. So I would say you would need to train your inside sales people for a few months before you really get them to handle those calls. What we have seen in the industry, people put their sales people after 2 days of training to just make a call with a script and blah, blah, blah. And then you know the results. You hardly get 10 connects, out of which 2 convert to a meeting, and most of these meetings don't happen, and those kind of things. One of the most important preparation that you need to do before making a cold call is objection handling. Have a separate list of objections for your gatekeeper, influencer, thought leader, user, or a buyer. Very different, because the user is going to have very different objections. It will be feature related. The buyer is going to have very different objections, which is going to be cost related, their decision making cycle related. Gatekeepers thing would be more of, oh, they are not interested in those kind of things. Those are the objections. Have a list ready of what are the objections that are going to come. And those objections you should read every day before you pick up the phone. Never say you are an expert in something. Never say it, just demonstrate it. You demonstrate it. How do you demonstrate it? Coming back to the conversation that you can have with the problem, about the problem that you're going to solve. That's the only way to demonstrate an expertise. Remember, the business lies in the follow-ups. Business does not lie in your initial emails. 48% of the salespeople never follow up with the prospect. 25% of salespeople make a second contact and stop. So these are kind of statistics which are there. And so what happens is your overall success rate is so low because persistency is what is key, and that is missing in most salespeople. Even successful salespeople who are senior in the organization are actually guilty of not being persistent with their follow-ups. So remember, prospects are immortal, whereas leads and opportunities die. If a particular company is a prospect for you, it will remain a prospect for you, and you can convert it into a lead anytime. But if it is a lead today, it may not be lead tomorrow, but it can become a lead after some time. So I say prospects are eternal. Go by only two things. Is the company right? And is the person you're talking to is the right party contact, which falls into one of the five categories that we discussed. Cold calling is a different skill from sales. You cannot get your salespeople who are skilled at doing enterprise selling to do cold calling. It's a different skill, different mindset it takes. It's a different kind of an approach. Salespeople can train the cold callers. They need to guide the cold callers to how they want the offering to be pitched or how they want the problem to be discussed, how they can do conversations. But typically, it's a very specialized skill set which should be done by very specialized people. Get your hiring right. Train them differently. Train them to handle objections. Train them to handle into conversations. Don't train them into pure pitching scripts and what we do, how great we are in those kind of things. If you train them to handle your problem, discuss the problems with the customers, they will be very successful. Evaluate them differently. See, they can't get you leads. They can't create opportunities for you. They can only enable conversation. After that, it's the role of the salesperson to take that conversation to a lead and then to an opportunity and approach. Hunt in groups. Always hunt in groups. This mistake is something which many companies do. They give one vertical for each inside sales executive. They will say, okay, you target companies in this geography or this vertical or whatever. It doesn't work like that. Simply because if you're calling certain people in certain company and they're not listening to your call, remember somebody else from your team should call that person, call those people, and your chances of success might be high. Remember, when you get cold calls, you normally remember the name of the person rather than the company from where the person was called. I'm talking specifically about B2B selling here. If your company is not very familiar, unless you are like an IBM or an Accenture, if I get a cold call as a CIO of a company, I would remember the person's name and not really the company's name. So if a particular inside sales executive is not getting passed through a gatekeeper or whatever, always good to get somebody to do it. So that is how we'll have to do team-based targets, a very, very team-based exercise. And we can even get to the next level here, because what typically we do is if a person is not getting via LinkedIn, then cold call, then does email. If the person is not able to get to that, we get somebody else to do it. And we see that people tend to do it. Typically what happens is if a person has decision maker has ignored somebody for some time, he or she will tend to ignore that person again and again. That is why somebody else can come and take that role and do that kind of pitching. Warm it up, it's not really a cold call. You can warm a prospect before you call them cold. How? By LinkedIn Connect, by emails, by commenting on their post. visiting their profiles, making sure they know. So when you call a Stephen Smith knows that there's Sam. Yeah, I've heard him somewhere. I remember his name. Maybe he had sent me an email or maybe he connected with me on LinkedIn. Warm it up. Just warm it up so that you are able to do an effective cold call. Referrals. Now, referrals, many people will argue that, ours is an early stage company. How will I have a referral? A referral is not about your company's references or not even your direct business references. It could be anywhere. I mean, it could be, I studied with so and so during school and he has got some interesting product and I think you should talk to him. Use this and then make that cold call. And the effectiveness of that is extremely high. People hesitate to use referrals, and that is where your success rates go down. Internal network. Many people, especially I see this in large organizations, salespeople do not leverage internal network effectively. Now, if you take a company that is well-established company in, say, an international hub, the salespeople of that company would be connected to the top decision makers of their industry in some way or the other. They would have worked in the past, they would have sold them something else, they would have met them in some conferences. People are not looking at that. And one way to look at it is through LinkedIn. If I'm targeting the banking and financial services industry, if I know 5 CIOs over there and I don't know the remaining 5, then the thing is, you will definitely be able to go to the profiles and see who is connected from the organization. And that is how internal reference is very important. If you use all this, your cold calling success rate is going to go much, much higher. It's all about trust. Do not call on their mobiles ever unless that number is given to you by the reception or the personal secretary, or they have themselves told you to call via email reply or something like that. Never call, because a call coming from an unknown number or call coming directly on a mobile, you are going to lose trust. And it's all about building trust. Thank you very much. This was my quick take on cold calling. Of course, it's a vast, vast area. What we have done is just a tip of the iceberg. And I hope some of the points I mentioned will be helpful. Happy to field any questions and happy to get into more details. If you want to connect with me, please do connect on my email, through my website, or via LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Samrat.
Thanks a
Yeah.
lot. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Good evening.
Yeah.